Hey everyone, you're listening to School of Block, a Canadian blockchain, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrency podcast that breaks it all down for newbies. I'm Adam Goldman, your host.
And I'm Steph, your newbie. We're going back to the basics. You're going to learn what blockchain is, how it's used, and why it's so important to the future of our economy. There are no dumb questions. Our goal is to bring crypto knowledge to everyone while making it as easy to understand as possible.
You're going to follow Steph on her journey from knowing nothing about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and blockchain to being an expert in the field.
Well, we'll see.
So a little bit about my background in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space. I started a website, Bitbuy.ca, a few years ago, and I really saw a need for infrastructure that had to be built in order for the progression, adoption, and sort of mainstream application of making people understand how to get it, where to find it, and at least starting to dabble in it. I also met Steph along my journey in the crypto space while doing a meetup, I believe, with Meet.to a couple of years back.
I think so, yeah. At that time, I was working for an agency and we were throwing events, and I remember you were one of the speakers, I believe. So I think that's where we met. It's been a long time since then. I think it's been like 2 years now. Kind of hard to remember. But from there, so I'm the founder and CEO of Origins Mag. So basically what we do is we interview entrepreneurs. So we thought it would be great to have Adam come on our podcast and website and do an interview where when I was interviewing you, realized that I knew absolutely no idea what you were talking about. I've interviewed a few people before, so I think I got myself through it. Hopefully you didn't know that I had no idea what you were saying. You probably did. But I realized that I need to know more. So I'm really excited to sit here with you and learn more about what you do and the space you're in.
Today we're going to be talking about Blockchain 101, which is the theme for the series of the podcast. We're going to be talking about what is blockchain, where did it come from, how does it work?
We're going to break it down to make it as simple as possible.
And hopefully by the end of 40 minutes, you'll have a great foundation and understanding of how blockchain, cryptocurrency, and other alternative type and related products are changing our world.
Well, to start off, I'm really interested to learn what exactly is blockchain.
So that's the basic fundamental question that I think everybody needs to ask. It's very high level.
Okay.
The explanation that I would like to give to yourself and the audience, because it can be very low level and very complex when we start talking about the types of ways in which a blockchain can be built or current examples that exist.
Okay.
So I think the best thing to start with is definition of a blockchain. What is a blockchain as defined by a Google search? So typically the first thing that comes up on a Google search will sound something among the lines of a digital ledger in which transactions are made in cryptocurrencies that are recorded chronologically and made available publicly.
So before we move on, what exactly is a ledger?
So going back to early accountant practices, for example, one of the initial methods of recording information for an accountant is in a journal. In a raw journal. And from the journal, you can begin to establish a ledger. And a ledger may simply consist of debits and credits for a specific account. So what that is fundamentally is just a store of information. So a ledger is something that can be referred to that records historic information.
So in your banking app, when you're looking at your account, you can see what's been taken out and put back in. Is that technically a ledger?
That's correct.
Okay.
So that would be an example of the bank's internal ledger. And look at that. You're already off to a great start. So one of the other ways that is very helpful in order to make people understand how blockchain works is there's a gentleman by the name of William Mugyar. A few years ago, he published an article on CoinDesk and on his blog that describes how blockchain is like Google Docs. And what that means is that if you can understand how Google Docs works in certain fashions, you can understand what the main purpose of a blockchain is.
Okay, so on Google Docs, I log on and a bunch of people can contribute to one document. What does that have to do with a blockchain?
So in the past, the example that Mugayer describes is simply when you wanted to make a collaborative effort on, for example, a Word document, all these people would have to send them around in order to make revisions. But in the case of Google Docs, there's only one single document, and it can be accessed by multiple people at the same time. So there's no losing track of edits and revisions or which draft is correct and which one had been marked up by legal counsel. And those are all important things to be aware of when you are creating documents of any type. And so in the case of Google Docs, what it does is it's a centralized store of the document. So you don't have multiple copies floating around the internet. You have one single copy that everybody can access. And so the same relation to a blockchain is that the ledger of information, the blockchain itself, is the store of information. So in the case of Bitcoin, when you send a transaction to me or I send a transaction to you, that information is accessed by multiple computers around the world that got our transaction and recorded it in the ledger.
So if I'm sending you a Bitcoin, why do I want a bunch of different parties looking at the transaction?
So one of the key issues has to do with trust, and this has to do with transactions that exist in an economy. So today we have a lot of trusted third parties. We use banks, we use payment processors, Visa, MasterCard, a lot of people to make sure that the interaction that we're taking, the transaction that's taking place, is legitimate and that nobody gets screwed over, if you will, for lack of a better term. So what happens with Bitcoin, and the reason that you would want the blockchain to be publicly available, is that there is no trusted third party that exists in the concept of sending Bitcoin. And so the replacement for the trusted third party is the blockchain itself. So the transaction being sent and recorded that everyone can see ensures to both you, the sender, and the person you're sending it to, that it in fact did occur, and that the receiver now has the Bitcoin that you sent them. So there are inherent flaws to that. Why do I want people to see my transactions, which I think is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And that really is based upon a set of conditions. So it's not your name that's going in the blockchain. It doesn't say Stephanie sent $10 worth of Bitcoin to Starbucks to pay for her coffee. It just doesn't say that. And so that information is obfuscated. So for the purposes of security, that's how a lot of publicly available information doesn't get shared with the wrong people.
Okay.
It's not that people are looking at your transaction. What they're looking at is the proof that the transaction occurred.
So you're essentially adding witnesses to a transaction.
That's a great way to actually consider it. Think of the blockchain as a witness. It basically is recording something, and to a standard of almost being under oath. So when you're applying such a standard, you can use the analogy that the under oath for a witness in court testifying as something occurring is the same as the high level of mathematical encryption that's involved in securing a transaction. So if there was a digital equivalent, I would say that based on your analogy, that could be a fair one to make in helping to understand blockchain. Okay.
So where did blockchain come from?
So blockchain is based on several key ideas. They all appeared prior to the appearance of Bitcoin being the first example. They are peer-to-peer sharing, which most of us know as the young generations in the formats of programs like BitTorrent. The second thing is encryption technologies that allowed us to use the internet and communication systems while protecting our privacy and our liberty. And the third thing would be open source software. So all of these things had to culminate and exist in order to create an environment for blockchain to appear on the scene.
Okay, so the first one, I get the first one because we all know peer-to-peer sharing,
Right.
Napster, all of that.
Correct.
How we get free music or not, because you shouldn't do that.
Right.
But the second one I'm a bit confused about. Can you dive into that a bit more?
Sure. So just before that, actually, let's just follow up on the peer-to-peer part,
Okay.
the BitTorrent part. So a very brilliant gentleman by the name of Bram Cohen created that application in I believe around 2000, 2001.
Okay.
And Bitcoin uses the exact same concept. Decentralized blockchains, just like the BitTorrent network, is so strong that it can't be shut down by a specific firewall or state actor because of the way it works. So, for example, with BitTorrents, as soon as you start downloading a file, that portion of the file that you've downloaded now becomes available for you to share to the network. So you're never holding the full file. The network holds the full file, and collectively all of us have the bits and pieces that make up the files we want to download. So in order to shut it down, you'd have to shut down the millions upon millions of torrent users that are connected to the network, because they're not stored on a central server. Like, there's no server where the Hollywood movies that we want to get or the music that we want to get are there. Those studios try to protect that data as best they can.
Of course.
So BitTorrent got around that by leveraging that concept of peer-to-peer data sharing, and that's exactly how a blockchain is stored. So just like all those movies and music was stored in a decentralized fashion on all our computers as soon as we started downloading files from the network, the same thing occurs in the Bitcoin network.
So just to talk about decentralized, so I think I'm getting the difference between centralized and decentralized, so I assume centralized means in one place, whereas decentralized means in a bunch of different places.
That's correct. And so one of the comparisons that we can use to illustrate that is you look at, you hear about Bitcoin, and we're going to dive into this a little bit later in the show, but you hear its definition as a decentralized peer-to-peer currency. And if you want to compare that as an alternative to using a bank, then what you would say about the bank is that the bank is a centralized network where your money is held, right? Because if you're with Toronto Dominion Bank, for example, your money is only sitting in TD Bank. It's not sitting in another bank. It's sitting in that central bank.
All right, Adam, I'm ready to buy a Bitcoin. Where do I go?
Well, there's many great choices out there in the market, but the best and most secure place with some of the most competitive fees in the business is the Bitbuy platform at Bitbuy.ca. Registering has never been easier. You can use your email address or simply sign in with your Facebook or your Google account. And once you're registered, you get verified and off to buying and selling crypto.
Sounds good.
So don't forget to check out Bitbuy.ca for all your buying and selling crypto needs.
And also, thanks for sponsoring this podcast.
So one of the other key important ideas to know about to describe where it comes from is encryption technology. So there's a very notable figure in the cryptology space that not many people may know about, but if you're involved in computer sciences, you're probably pretty familiar with a gentleman by the name of Phil Zimmermann, who created a tool for the internet called PGP, which stands for Pretty Good Privacy, and it was the world's first attempt at creating a tool that allowed us to encrypt communications that were sent over the internet. And the reason that Phil Zimmermann wanted to build such a tool is because in the early 90s, the U.S. government had proposed regulation that would force all the service providers, all the internet companies, cell phone companies, to hand over individuals' private messages. And the problem with that was it was in direct violation with the First Amendment of the Constitution in the United States,
Absolutely.
Which is free speech. I mean, people have the right to privacy, and they have the right to communicate in privacy. So he creates this first ever publicly available encryption tool called PGP, and it was so successful, in fact, that a few years later, the government tried to throw him under the bus, and the U.S. Customs Agency had charged him under the Arms Export Control Act for selling the encryption tool to enemies of the United States. Eventually it was dropped as there was nothing, there was no evidence that could prosecute him. But it was very significant because it was the first attempt in the modern world with the evolution of the internet and technology where somebody thought about protecting First Amendment rights on digital systems.
Okay, so how does it work?
So encryption is based on mathematics, and without being an engineer or mathematician myself, I don't want to get too caught up. But basically, it involves the use of mathematics and complex algorithms in order to wrap things or embed things or encode things in such a way that it obfuscates the information as it transits from point A to point B.
Okay, so it changes it.
It in a sense it changes it. Correct.
So let's say I'm sending you something.
Correct.
And it's under my name. So would it change, let's say, my name, Steph, STPH, to 1234?
Depending on the type of mathematics applied, and it would be a lot more complex. But that's a pretty good analogy. Is it basically thinking back to the examples from the World Wars when the Germans had machines that eventually the Americans cracked, and we were able to the Allies were able to listen in on where their fleets were and their subs were, and it was called the Enigma machine, and that was basically encoding information. So that's exactly right. It obfuscates data in transit. It changes the data so that it doesn't get revealed as it moves from point A to point B. And so that was very important because Bitcoin is very heavily based on the use of encryption technologies. As we briefly had talked about when you said, why should everybody see my transaction on the blockchain? Well, they just see the transaction because the actual transaction itself is encrypted.
So there's basically just a record that it went from point A to point B, so it can never be disputed.
Correct.
Okay.
So, and that really just has to do with trust, because the alternative was simply having to have a trusted third party.
Makes sense.
So the last and key piece that I believe is really important is the evolution of open source software. So there's pay software and there's open source software, and Bitcoin is open source software. So that all kind of starts in the mid 70s, late 70s, early 80s at MIT. A gentleman named Richard Stallman created a really clever application where basically the problem was that at MIT the printers were on a different floor than the lab that he was working in. So he created a tool that would let people know when their printing job was done or if there was an error in the printer. And the printing company didn't like that, and they eventually put things in their own software that restricted the use of his tool. And he thought that was total blasphemy, and that anybody who wanted to use software should be able to freely use it, freely modify it, and very much disagreed with the corporate approach.
So is open software then essentially just what it sounds like, open, so that way any developer can jump on and start changing or innovating it?
Correct. So it was after that episode that he actually left MIT and founded something that's called the GNU project. And the GNU project is the general public usage license. So probably the world's most successful piece of software, which is the Linux operating system, was created shortly after the GNU project had established a standard for creating freely available software. And Bitcoin is using the same license as well. And that's why we've seen such a flurry of alternative cryptocurrencies and different blockchains, because Bitcoin is just one of thousands. It being the oldest and it being the first gives it notoriety, but because it exists under an open source license, the developers of the world and the creativity of their minds is opening Pandora's box for the mainstream adoption and use of this technology.
Okay, so can you give me some examples of how blockchain is used in the real world? I know we've touched on Bitcoin. I think most people might know what Bitcoin is, but let's jump into that.
Sure. I think one of the really practical examples of using Bitcoin has been remittance around the world. So, for example, up here in Canada, there's a large Filipino community that is very heavily focused in the family care business. And a lot of this community repatriates a lot of currency back home to the Philippines. And in order to do so, they're stuck using traditional mechanisms, whether it be the big banks or Western Union type payday loans places that charge exorbitant fees and are also not regulated to the degree of the banks. So while they've been forced to remit money via these methods, it's been quite costly, and that's on top of the government tax that is applied to the income that's generated. And so one of the solutions in the last few years to repatriate money has been to convert cash into Bitcoin and to remit the Bitcoin to the Philippines and to liquidate the Bitcoin once in the Philippines with infrastructure down there in order to get access to the fiat currency that's required. So I think that's a very practical example of how even Bitcoin in its current form has begun to change a lot of lives around the globe.
Are there no fees associated with sending Bitcoin?
That's not entirely true. The concept of fees is a little bit different in Bitcoin. So in the traditional world, fees are a source of revenue for most companies. Whereas in the Bitcoin network, the fees that are paid within the network, so this isn't fees, for example, that you would pay to a company that's selling you crypto. These are the actual network fees, the cost to send the actual transaction onto the network. It is very low in comparison to what the traditional methods tell us. So one great example from history is that if you wanted to send $6 million, for example, from the United States to Europe, it would cost you between $180,000 and $200,000. That's a lot of money
Yeah.
for simply somebody updating a record in a ledger somewhere. It's kind of an insult to somebody's intelligence. So in the case of sending the same amount of value over the Bitcoin network, it can be done for about 50 cents. Now, at the time that this example that I'm telling you was true, I believe it was a few years ago in the history of Bitcoin's blockchain, because subsequently, as the network receives more participants, so people buying Bitcoin, people building companies, people running software, the network governs itself in such a way, to the best of its ability, so as to not provide any favoritism with fees, because this is, again, related to being open and distributed and achieving types of consensus, right? So nothing is specifically in one place.
So essentially, Bitcoin was developed to save people money.
I would say that's one of the large reasons behind why.
Okay.
Because if you also look at when it was released to the world, around the 2008, 2009, that's right around the economic collapse. And it very well could have been a reaction to that scenario, which was very detrimental to the world economies at the time.
For sure.
And it's very interesting to see that a piece of technology could be the answer to banks that were poorly managed and that were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. Because what we're using is that encryption, that hardcore mathematics, to make sure that things can't be changed.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is a buzzword. So why is it so increasingly volatile? I mean, we've seen it increase over the past year. It kind of went from obscurity to everyone's talking about it. Can you dive into that? Why is it so up and down, and what is this thing that everyone's really going on about?
Absolutely. So this is one of the main areas of curiosity for people learning about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. There's probably a few reasons, in my opinion, why I believe it's so volatile. I think we could just start with some of the basic rationale. It's new. It's very new. Things that are new usually need to go through a period of proving themselves, period of validation. In the case of Bitcoin, I think we are quite past that moment, although as there's a market that's so diverse with other cryptocurrencies and platforms, there's a lot of validation that has to occur from what else is out there in the market. So that's one opinion that I attribute to volatility. Another opinion has to do with regulation. So because it's an unregulated industry, asset class, commodity class, currency class, however it's being defined in any particular jurisdiction, I think that causes a lot of uncertainty for market participants. So when something doesn't have high levels of standardization that protects consumers and things like that, it's hard for people to, jump off the horse and kind of put their foot into the pool because it's not regulated, right? So there is a lot to be said, despite my personal reservations about large government regulation, it is also required in a lot of industries in order to establish trust, because there could be inherent dangers or problems that can affect you as a consumer, and so you don't want to be exposed to that, especially with something so new. Another thing that I would attribute is definitely, and this has to do with the earlier point of not being regulated, is manipulation. So every time there's there's no set of standards, no set of regulation, that leaves you open to manipulation, and there are a lot of opportunities in order to manipulate Bitcoin. So, for example, all of the places to obtain Bitcoin all over the world, the exchanges, the buying services, the brokerages, none of them are connected to any typical index, for example, like traditional stock markets are. So you can go on your phone and open up the stocks app and get a pretty accurate quote of the price of all the stocks in the stock markets. That's not necessarily the case with Bitcoin, because there isn't a standardized platform yet to which that information can be accurately looked at. Now, the problem is that because it's decentralized, that's actually not an objective of Bitcoin to create standards as such. That's a debatable topic, but I think because it's unregulated, it just leaves it open to a lot of manipulation. And then recently in December, when they had announced Bitcoin futures in Chicago, that began to open up a lot of institutional money to have exposure against the price of Bitcoin. And so they're able to manipulate it as such as well. One of the last things that I could attribute is probably market fears. So most of the mainstream reporting that's done on Bitcoin usually talks about catastrophic events or episodes involving criminal activity, people stealing, people getting hacked, businesses not being set up properly, governments talking about money laundering, things like that lend to its volatility. So without having a crystal ball, those are the points that I would say attribute to its volatility.
On the note of criminal activity that you just touched on, I'm curious, how common is it that the Bitcoins or cryptocurrencies get hacked? I know it's generally referred to as the Wild West because there's no regulation, as we were just talking about. So can you elaborate a bit on that?
Absolutely. So it's not that Bitcoin itself or any of the cryptocurrencies themselves get hacked. That is sort of the magnificence of the mathematics behind a blockchain. But rather the entities, the people behind operating certain businesses and certain projects and pieces of software are susceptible to human flaws. And so therefore, it's very easy for them to make mistakes when implementing security measures and the proper ways to implement a safe environment for these products. For example, the most famous one would be Mt. Gox. In 2013, it was a large exchange that was hacked. And now remember, it wasn't Bitcoin that was hacked. It was the exchange that was hacked, and then the Bitcoins were stolen. So the blockchain itself has never been hacked. And that's due to the encryption, to the mathematics, the high level of work that went into developing those
Does the
platforms.
blockchain record hacks?
It does not. However, most blockchains, if not all, besides their main purpose, can also simply embed information into a transaction of text. So, for example, if I sent you Bitcoin for payment, I could also include a bunch of text in there about what it's for, and I could either choose to encode it, not make it publicly available, or leave it in plain text, and you'd be able to read it. You'd be able to reference it. So that's a very clever way, but it's not done automatically. And there are instances in other platforms like Ethereum where flaws are identified and exploited, and in that case, they have to be addressed. So there is a big difference between some of the currencies, not just in what they do, but how the project, foundation, or company was set up in order to maintain the platform.
Okay, why do you invest in Bitcoin then?
So I think there's a few things that attract Bitcoin to my investment appetite, and one of them is one of the key points we touched on, which is being decentralized. So because it does not have the ability to be controlled by a specific actor like a government or a bank, I think that gives me a high level of confidence that this value that's inherent in Bitcoin isn't being manipulated by such a person. Just like gold. Gold is not owned specifically by any one person or government. It's a precious metal that's found in the earth, and it's scarce, and you have to dig it out and you have to find it. And so there is a similarity between that, and it's very hard. You can't really regulate a precious metal, something that occurs naturally in nature to many. You can't shut it off forever, which is my point. So that's why it has a very attractive quality.
Bitcoin is a digital currency. So how does it have value?
So this is one of the hard questions to answer with anything that has value. I would attribute Bitcoin's value to its utility. So the problems that it solves and the things that it achieves provides usefulness and utility to its participants, and so therefore it has value in that sense. When you compare directly to a currency, there are many characteristics to which it compares directly and is better in all senses. So one of the main problems with traditional currency operated by a government is that they can print as much as they want. And that can devalue the power of the currency. And that has been exactly the case for the last several hundred years with all currencies, including the US dollar. So when you begin to add characteristics to it, like there can only be a certain amount, that means you're forcing scarcity. So you're making it more like gold in that sense than a US dollar. And that as time goes on, there's less that can be had, and people lose them, and they get stolen. And so therefore, that begins to make them rare, and scarcity and being rare creates value.
Of course.
In that context.
What do you think the future of blockchain looks like?
So I think the future of blockchain is very bright. I think blockchain has the power to revolutionize a lot of the infrastructure that runs a lot of the companies that exist today. The financial sector is a huge area right now that's currently being worked on. People are working on blockchain in the financial sector because they see it as a great solution to a lot of the challenges that they face when it comes to exchanging information, exchanging value, moving things between each other, trusting each other. These are very important facets of business when entities engage. They want to trust each other, and they want to be able to continue to do that. And so I think also with respect to just how technology progresses in general, we're seeing a high demand for jobs in the sector, and jobs and full departments that are being created at traditional companies to explore the use of and implement blockchain in their own traditional systems. So a lot of problems, for example, like even on Facebook. With the recent issues with Facebook and them having to go before Congress to testify, they were basically asked a pretty simple question. Are you a news organization like the CNN and the New York Times, or are you a political actor? And so therefore you have the right as a company to censor certain speech that you want, because that's your right. But if you're calling yourself an open public forum, like a newspaper or like a thing, then you can't censor anyone, because that is not how that qualifies. And so I think blockchain, for example, has the power to eliminate some of these problems with controlling, exchanging, and recording information.
Do you think it will replace banks?
I don't think the banks are going anywhere for the most part, but it could replace a lot of the bank's internal infrastructure. So the banks themselves are using very old software, and blockchain could potentially be just the right new technology that allows these companies to revolutionize or update a lot of these antiquated things that we're still using today. Okay, Steph, so now for the hard part. We're going to do a little pop quiz, test your knowledge. You ready?
I think so.
Awesome. So after today's lesson, are you thinking you're going to buy some Bitcoin?
Absolutely.
And where do you think the best place to buy online would be?
I think it's Bitbuy.ca.
And this one's a toughie. What are the 3 key ideas that blockchain is built upon?
Well, Adam, after you explained it to me, I believe it's peer-to-peer sharing, encryption, and open source software.
Excellent. Congratulations on finishing your pop quiz on the Blockchain 101 podcast.
Well,
and we
thank
look
you.
forward to more perfect scores from Stephanie.
Me too.
So today we nailed down exactly what blockchain is, where it came from, and how it can be used. We also discussed Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and the state of regulation and volatility in the industry.
So after today, I can say that blockchain is a digital ledger that stores information chronologically and is made publicly available. So basically Google Docs.
Right on.
And it came from early evolutions of encryption software, open source technology, and peer-to-peer sharing of information.
Awesome. And since the beginning, blockchain has solved a multitude of problems from finance to healthcare, from shipping to voting, and from social media to gaming. Blockchain will continue to revolutionize different industries by lending its capabilities to world economies.
Thank you for listening to School of Block, a Canadian podcast about blockchain, Bitcoin, and cryptocurrency that breaks it all down for newbies. I'm Steph, your newbie.
And I'm Adam, your host. Join us again next week on School of Block for another episode.